What I want to explore in this presentation is what happens to creativity and innovation when the macro environment turns turbulent, becomes more uncertain. Let me start by making this statement. This is the blackest of black swans. Some of you may not be aware of what is meant by a black swan event. So I will go over the idea very briefly here. A black swan is an event or an observation which invalidates a proposition which you previously thought to be true. So the first 100 swans that you encounter turn out to be white, and from that experience, you develop this proposition that all swans are white. But then you go to Australia and find that swans can be black. And that one observation invalidates the proposition that you thought to be true. So essentially, black swan events and observation change our worldview. 9/11, for example, is often cited as a black swan event. But then, why do I call this the blackest of black swans? Because the level of disruption is unmatched in history. This is truly unprecedented. These two graphs illustrate the point I'm making. The one on the left in blue shows the surge in unemployment claims in the US. The one on the right in red shows the unemployment rate in India, which has shot up to around 30%. I have put up these two graphs just to illustrate the point that this is truly a global phenomenon. This pandemic has affected both developed and developing nations. Important to note, though, that it is not the pandemic which is the black swan here. Rather, it is the pandemonium which it has triggered. Pandemics are actually not that infrequent. We have had pandemics before. But what is unprecedented is the way the global economic juggernaut has come to a grinding halt. No one expected that international travel will be suspended like this, and half of the global population will be living under lockdown conditions. If anyone is claiming out there that they expected this situation to arise, I don't think they are being totally honest. So, how this will pan out? I think we're all grappling with this question. And as I am admittedly a bit biased towards the historical method, the thought which immediately comes to my mind is whether history can be of any help here. I think it can be, but only to a limited extent. The novel coronavirus has led to what I'm calling here the Great Lockdown. And the Great Lockdown is essentially the global economic locomotive coming to a screeching halt. Now, history actually tells us that there is no precedence of this situation. The closest the world has come to this situation in the past was during the Great Depression in 1930s. It is not a fair comparison because 2020 is very different to 1930. The world in 1930s was nowhere as connected as it is now. But it is the best we have got, so we will run with the comparison. We can explore creativity at various levels: individual, organizational, national, or intergovernmental. In normal times, we know that innovation and creativity happen at all these levels. There are well established theories and frameworks which allow us to analyze innovation in each of these levels. The issue is that these theories and frameworks have been developed in normal times and for normal times. So we really do not know whether they work in times of turbulence. So let's do some time traveling and go back to 1930s, the time of Great Depression, but also following from the Great Depression, the start of the Second World War, which continued right up to 1945, as we know. And these two together constitute the time of great disruption, a turbulent time. And although obviously there was widespread poverty, destruction, and loss of human life in this very depressing period of human history, there were also lots of examples of creativity and innovation. Movies are collaborative efforts, typically. So, why do I say that The Great Dictator was an expression of individual creativity? Because Chaplin wrote the script, directed the movie, and of course, starred in the main role. And we know where the motivation of the film came from. The ills of the Second World War directly inspired the production of the movie. 3M introduced its ubiquitous Scotch tape during the Great Depression, and it quickly gained in popularity because people found it very useful to patch up torn documents and books. Interestingly enough, 3M has another best selling product in 2020 in the Great Lockdown. Any guess which product I'm referring to here? It is, of course, 3M's N95 face mask range. At the national level, there was the New Deal, a creative response by Franklin Roosevelt in the US to deal with widespread unemployment and lack of growth in the economy. The New Deal was essentially an unprecedented level of public expenditure affected by the government to offset the lack of consumption, the lack of private investment. The New Deal laid out the blueprint of how governments should act in times of economic crisis. The post Second World War period saw a phenomenal increase in collaboration between nation states. European states, in particular, realized that war is no longer an option and they got to find a new collaborative way forward. But the first intergovernmental collaboration in the post Second World War period was the Marshall Plan, led by the United States for primarily the redevelopment of Europe. Despite the odd recession here and there, I think overall the track record of economic development is very good in the post Second World War period, and the credit, I think, largely goes to the increased collaboration between nation states. So, what about the Great Lockdown? Again, we see creative responses all around us. We are really spoiled for choices here. On an individual level, perhaps the biggest impact has been made by Captain Tom Moore, who has raised now more than £27 million for NHS just by walking his back garden 100 times. Now, some may say that walking your back garden 100 times is not particularly creative, but that would be missing the point. Creativity is a social reality. If people accept a particular act as creative, it becomes so. It is as simple as that. And in case of Captain Tom Moore, clearly a huge section of the British population consider his action as meaningful and impactful, and as a result, they have contributed heavily to the cause. Lots of companies responding creatively to the COVID crisis. For example, Brewdog, a pub chain and a brewery, has started producing hand gel. They have surplus alcohol now, demand being low, and they have started converting that alcohol into hand gel and supplying to hospitals and to NHS and creating a lot of goodwill in the process. At the governmental level, we have had the coronavirus job retention scheme. It is kind of UK's version of the New Deal. And it is striking because the fiscal stimulus as a percentage of GDP in the UK has been higher than, say, in Germany and France, which coming from a conservative government is quite surprising. What has been missing in the great lockdown up until now is joined up international response to the COVID crisis. And that is perhaps because in a number of countries, there are nationalist parties in power who don't believe in international collaborations. One of the biggest myths relating to innovation is that constraints are bad for innovation. More constraints you encounter, lesser becomes your ability to innovate. In reality, constraints are often good for you. Constraints trigger innovation, constraints focus your mind, often force you to do as much or even more with less. The examples that we have seen from the Great Depression and the Great Lockdown show us that constraints are not barriers to innovation. In fact, they often spur human creativity. To understand why the myth that constraints act as barriers to innovation has taken roots in our imagination, we have to appreciate that there are two approaches to innovation: closed and open. The closed innovation approach is focused on acquisition, protection, and exploitation of intellectual properties. The closed approach became the dominant way of doing innovation, particularly in the corporate sector and the Western world, from late 19th century onward. But if you take the long view, the historical perspective, the open approach is actually the more traditional way of doing innovation, where the focus is not on exercising your intellectual property rights, but knowledge is considered as a public good, it is freely shared, and imitation is the norm and not the exception. In the literature, the open approach has been explored by different scholars in different ways using different terms like user led innovation, Jugaad innovation, open source innovation, crowdsourcing. But the common theme is that the focus is not on exercising intellectual property rights, exploitation of IPs, but sharing of knowledge and the common public good. The idea behind user led innovation is that new and important modifications of existing products, which are new innovation in their own right, are brought about often by lead users of those products and not by companies doing market research and finding out what customers want. A good example of user led innovation is mountain bikes. The idea of mountain bikes did not originate in a corporate design lab. Rather, users of bicycles who wanted to use it in the mountain terrains adapted them for the purpose. They put motorcycle drum brakes and balloon tires, and only later bike companies got into the act. Jugaad is an Indian word which essentially means that you come up with a solution for a problem that you're facing with the resources that you have got. Jugaad innovation is sometimes also called frugal innovation. The open source movement is perhaps the most self consciously anti intellectual property rights approach to innovation. The open source can take different forms: open source software, open source hardware, open source design. And this is RipRap, an open source design example. It is a 3D printer. The design of it is freely available. So, what is it going to be like, the post C19 era? Is it going to be like a post apocalyptic survival scenario, like the one depicted in the Road movie? Or is it going to be sunlit uplands, nature rebooting itself, the sky bluer, and our rivers running clear? Neither, we can confidently say. We are most likely heading to a deep recession, but we will eventually come out of it. And innovation will continue to play a key role in bringing about new products and services and also helping us to get out of the oncoming recession. I also think we will move towards a more open approach to innovation. We have to collaborate more with each other virtually rather than being together in a confined physical space. And I think this will push us towards a more open approach of sharing knowledge and practices. That's all from my side. Thank you.